Next up, we have Adam Banks. He's going to talk to us about creepy crawlies, farming insects for food. Adam runs an insect farm in Lincolnshire, producing crickets as food ingredients. He's also a fan of biking and has completed a 5,000-mile trip around Europe with his partner Lauren to get fit for his Nuffield. Adam's study looks at farming insects for food and what opportunities there might be for businesses in the UK to get involved in this new sector. He's also director of the Woven Network, the UK's organisation for insects as food and feed. Over to you.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank the Food Chain Scholarship for making this study possible. Although I'm not sure that my long-suffering mother, nor my partner Lauren, who I think is here today with our baby daughter Daisy, would necessarily share those sentiments, as they were stuck in a hot, smelly shed looking after millions of crickets whilst I was off travelling around the world. That said, I did spend much of my Nuffield journey in other people's hot and smelly sheds, so perhaps we're even. I just want to say that all the facts and figures that we've got on the here in the presentation are in my report, which is available on the Nuffield International website to download. But let's start with the problem. Meat production. In the 1960s, we produced around about 75 million tons of meat globally. If we fast forward just one generation, and we now produce nearly 5 times that amount. Now, the UN predicts that by 2050, global meat production will have exceeded 450 million tons. Now, the UK consumes, on average, 78 kilos of meat per person per year. But we're by no means the world leaders in terms of our appetite for meat. In fact, we come in at around about 30th in the world. Nevertheless, if the whole planet were to, on average, eat as much meat as we do in the UK, then we would have to put aside nearly 95% of all the habitable land area on the planet into agriculture. And this doesn't take into account a growing global population. By 2050, there'll be 9.7 billion people on the planet. And to feed that many people meat, we're going to have to seriously reevaluate our food production systems. So there are various alternatives talked about. Cultured meat is often discussed, but this is very expensive and energy intensive to produce. And then we've got plant-based meat substitutes, so things like the Impossible Burger, plant-based products like Beyond Meat, but their environmental credentials are dubious, and they're often heavily criticized for being highly processed. So suffice to say, I believe there's a better option, and no prizes for guessing what that is. So I think at this point it would be useful to compare farmed insects against farmed poultry. Now, chicken is often touted as being the most environmentally friendly form of meat, so I think it would be worthwhile here having a comparison between farmed poultry and farmed crickets. So if we look first at feed conversion ratios, well, we'll see that the crickets come out on top. And it's worth noting here that this is crickets fed on poultry feed, a feed that's been tailored to suit the nutritional requirements of that bird. So if we'd spent the 50 years perfecting that diet in optimizing a diet for insects, then just imagine how good that feed conversion ratio could be. Then if we look at the percentage of the animal that's actually consumed and digested, well, 40% of that bird is wasted. Its feathers, entrails, bones, none of that is consumed. On the other hand, we consume the whole insect and are able to digest nearly 95% of it. And that which we can't digest is the chitin, or the exoskeleton of the insect. And recent clinical trials have shown that to be a valuable prebiotic. So if we go to the land requirements, the overall land required to produce 1 kilo of edible protein, well, we need 80 square meters to produce that kilo of poultry protein, and yet just half that to produce a kilo of insect protein. So if we go back to our world view, if everyone on the planet were to eat as much meat as we do in the UK today, but that meat were to come from insects, then we would only have to put aside around 38% of all our habitable land into agriculture. And it's worth noting that it's actually less than we use today. The figure's closer to 50%. Right, so some of the issues. At the moment, generally speaking, insect protein is more expensive than protein from conventional livestock. And part of the issue there is scale. Here we've got a photograph of my cricket farm in Lincolnshire. So there's about 100 square meters there of climate-controlled space, and I achieve an output of just under 500 kilos a month of crickets. My costs of production are probably 5 times that of a typical broiler unit, and a lot of that has to do with scale. This is a very small operation. Now, I was visited on my Nuffield travels, the owners of Entimo Farms. Now, this is a Canadian cricket farm that uses ex-poultry sheds to rear about 10 tons of insects a month. Now, in terms of farming insects for human consumption, that is about as big as a farm gets at the moment. And their cost of production reflect that increase in scale. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got something like this. This is the new Protix facility in the Netherlands. Now, they will have an output of around about 1,000 tons a month of insect protein. And although they're farming fly larvae for animal feed, some of the technologies they've used there could be transferable to the food production sector. Now, the other issue we've got is automation or lack of it. This was the Krekker mealworm farm in the Netherlands, and most insect farms look something like this, with trays or boxes of insects being fed by hand. It's very labor-intensive. Now, Krekker was bought by a startup company called Protifarm. And I have to be careful what I say here, because when I visited Protifarm, they had me sign the longest non-disclosure agreement I've ever seen. But essentially, they've automated the entire production process for mealworms. So they're able to hatch the mealworm, rear the larvae to maturity, harvest it, blanch it, and freeze it with no human intervention whatsoever. So I guess you could call that the hands-free mealworm. But sorry, that's terrible. I apologize, John. Right, so now I'm afraid this bit's a little bit dense. The regulations covering insects are a little complex. But essentially, insects for food used to be a bit of a free-for-all. There were no regulations covering what insect products could be placed on the market in the UK. That's all changed with the introduction of new EU novel food regulations. And we're currently in a transitional period. And what that means is the only insect products that are allowed to be placed on the market are those which were already on the market before the new regulations came into effect, and for which there has been a novel food application dossier submitted to the European Food Standards Agency. So there's only 5 species to which that applies. We've got the migratory locust, the house cricket, the banded cricket, mealworm, and lesser mealworm. And now, to complicate things further, some of these applications are data protected. And what that means is that if the application is approved, only the company that submitted that application is allowed to continue to sell it. So the banded cricket, for example, there's only one application for that species of insect, and it's data protected. So if that's approved, anyone else producing that insect will potentially have to take their product off the shelves unless a further application is submitted. So I went into this Nuffield journey thinking that the idea of eating insects in the West was a new one. But it isn't. This gentleman, Vincent Holt, was trying to convince Victorians to eat insects about 150 years ago. And his pioneering insect cookbook contains some real gems. 2 of my favorites were moths on toast and fried cockchafer larvae. But as delicious as they sound, obviously the idea hasn't caught on. So what's the issue? Well, this prejudice against insects as food is really deeply ingrained. And other cultures around the world outside of Europe don't have this problem. Insects have formed parts of traditional diets for forever. But what has been shown, study after study, is that children are far more willing to try insects than their parents are. So if we're going to win over a society to the idea of eating insects, that's where we need to start, at the next generation. And I think this photograph sums it up quite nicely. You've got Dr. Sarah Bainan and Andy Holcroft, who've developed an insect-based meat substitute. And so with support from the Welsh Government, they've actually rolled that out as a more sustainable, healthier alternative to traditional school meals. And this pilot project's been so successful that they've now rolled it across to 3 further local authorities. So, in conclusion, yes, there are some real technical and regulatory challenges that we still need to overcome, and the yuck factor is a very real issue that we've got to push past. Nonetheless, I'm optimistic about the future of the industry, and I think the question now is not, is there a market for insects as food, but rather, how large will that market be? Thank you.